Oh, here we go. What's up, world? I am Thunder Thief, and today we are talking about the 8th track on my album, Past Amore. This one's called Literal. This song was inspired by contention and going one way and then going the next way and sort of trying to take people on this journey that moved from sad to happy and hanging out in some places in between and being cool with that. And this first guitar part was what I first started writing to. That kind of has this like melancholy sound to it. And as soon as I played that little riff, I recorded that and immediately laid down a second melody. And that one has a lot nicer of a vibe to it. Honestly, I hear that in isolation and think it's a very happy and like fun collection of notes. And when you play them together, it has this really interesting like chord combination. Those two playing together, I thought immediately, well, let's put a third on there and see what that sounds like. And so I started playing a little higher up on my guitar, and it's amazing my discoveries that I make on my guitar every day. Like, I've been playing guitar for, almost 20 years, and I still feel like there's a multitude of things to discover on there. The bass included too, but there's something about the electric guitar, just I think more because of the way that it sounds and what it can sound like, that it's exciting to be playing these like high register notes and think I could turn this into almost anything. So I wrote out this third guitar part being as playfully spirited as the other two, but having a slight difference so you could hear when you were listening to the track that these were 3 different guitars playing this. And there's really only a slight rhythmic difference, but when you hear all 3 of them together, you can definitely separate them. There's a ton of electronic music that does that exact same sort of concept with a synthesizer and just has a couple of notes making up a chord and progressively moving through it. And I think one of my favorite aspects of the music that I make is I try to turn to a guitar before I turn to a synthesizer, and I try to turn to a synth when I would like default use a guitar. So it challenges me a lot to start making a song in a different space. And the more I explore that natural objection and challenge, the more I come up with interesting things that I've never heard before. And that is the most exciting part about making music to me is, I was talking with my friend the other day about submitting to playlists and you get a lot of feedback, things like, hey, this song sounds real cool, doesn't fit what I do, or I just don't know where to put this, or something in that regard. And to me, like, that's been a story for every artist forever. Like, you hear Dr. Dre submitting The Chronic and every record label turning him down for it. There's stories like that everywhere, and I think it is something that sharpens you as an artist, and not necessarily like, you can kind of take it in two ways. You can say, okay, I'm going to fold and go with the tide of where music's going right now. Or you can go, I'm going to make this so irrefutable that when someone gets a hold of it that does believe in it and click with it, it pushes harder, it goes wider, it cuts deeper into a person when they listen to it. And I'm really excited about that. Like, I really like being hard to define and having a unique show and a unique exploration of music. Like, that's the beauty of being a music producer. There's never been a more diverse palette of music in history than there is today. And it'll just continue to get weirder and crazier and cast a wider net to where more of the world can become interconnected with something that reaches their hearts. You can't play those guitar chords and not have some sort of lush backing behind it. And I was looking for like a long pad synth sound, because that guitar riff is already like pretty staccato and has a lot of attack. So I wrote this progression. That little click you hear in there is the sidechain compression from when the kick hits, but I kind of like showing you those things because this is what the sound actually sounds like, but because the kick drum's hitting at the same time, you never hear that. Those chords are so like lush and pretty, and they sit really well on top of that progression, but I wanted there to be some sort of distinction between when the high guitar part hits and like the sort of bridge area versus the beginning. And I took those chords and just reversed them. It has this kind of chiller underwater type of sound to it. And I took a sample of the chord progression, reversed it, cut off a spot, and threw a filter on it to just sort of like wash over the top a little bit more, to just be like a background sound, but then in one part of the song become more of like a integral part of the rhythm section and just the vibe in general. But when you have something like long and floaty like that, I wanted something else that had some attack and some punch, and the bass in this track I think is my favorite part of the whole thing. I really like when bass makes you bounce and has this energy and like jumpiness to it that is as interesting as it is warm. Instead of just being washed in a sea of bass, it's just like these nice little hugs and pats on the back that are comforting but not everlasting. And here's what I ended up with. My bass sound design on synthesizers is so rooted in like trance and techno and things like that. Like, those are my favorite bass sounds. And hearing it back after letting it go for a while and just letting it do its release thing, it's interesting to think about like the kind of remixes that you could do with just taking that bass and going somewhere. The natural place to go with that bass is like a house beat. So I wanted to make, 4 on the floor type of beat, but have the snare act a little more like an indie snare and be in some unsuspecting places, and have that beat, break up sometimes, and have, honestly, I think I was aiming for like an indie drum type of sound with this, because the guitars are kind of indie sounding. And I guess if I were to, like, I've been calling this record alt house as the genre, but maybe like indie house is more of a appropriate term, though indie's so deep in a bunch of different ways. Like, I was just thinking about like Block Party and Interpol and those type of bands and how their drummer plays. And I wanted to write a drum part that acted like that. And I think I did a pretty good job. Here's what it sounds like. The way that interplays with the bass too, like that snare just kind of hits sometimes with the same bass hits. And I'm liking exploring that idea quite a bit in this dance music world because a lot of times in like house and techno and other things, like the kick and the bass live together, but they live separately. Like the kick's supposed to hit and the bass is supposed to hit in between. And those are like the most fun and playful moments in like the rhythm section. Like when I was coming up in the rock world and everything, like the bass followed the kick. Like you guys were just together all the time. And in dance music a lot, it's like you kind of want them separate because the kick is like really warm and big and has its own like bass and sub bass undertones. And then like the bass can have it too, but it can be two different things. So like that whole frequency area has got more variety to it. It's not just the whoa, 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 like long, loud, crazy sounds, which are sick too. But you know, if you're watching a movie, like you don't want action and crazy explosions the whole time. You want them to happen every now and again to cause those dynamics and those variations. And that can make a part be more interesting and honestly last longer. In 2020, I bought a actual field recorder. I've always had this habit of recording sounds that I like and doing little dialogue things or sketching out ideas on my notes on my phone, just like the recording app. But when you throw those audio files into a song that you've been like working on the environment of, it definitely was kind of a one note sort of thing and didn't encapsulate like the whole environment that you were in. So I stepped up my game and got a field recorder. And in 2020, like getting outside and going like the national parks and exploring Colorado was a huge focus for me and my girlfriend. We just wanted to go to a bunch of places that we hadn't had time or made time to go to before. And I have just a bunch of recordings from those different walkabouts. And this one, I can't remember the park's name, but I remember just taking a bunch of different recordings of throwing rocks into rivers and just walking around and just, I mean, the general sound of a river is like the perfect white noise because it's ever changing, but natural in a more sophisticated way than white noise generators. And there's also something cool about just hearing the world around you in a moment that can't be recreated or re-recorded. So getting to have those moments is really nice. It sits real low, but here's the excerpt that I use the most. You can just hear some people talking a little bit and the river flowing, and it just helped bring this song to that real, natural place. In the bridge of this track, I turn everything in reverse, basically, except for the drums. I do that a lot. Like, when I first started learning how to sample and stuff like that, like, reversing something just changes the whole game. And you start thinking about things in when they end versus when they start. It can be a really disorienting type of energy, hearing something in reverse that, like, you'd been hearing played normal the whole time. But I loved what happened when I reversed all the guitars. Like, that's a riff that I had already thought about, but got totally rearranged just by reversing it. And I created something entirely new again. The thing about this song, as far as the guitar tones go, is that, and something on my album that I learned later on, was I stuck with a lot of similar tones for it. This whole album was written on my guitar, and I was focused on the differences in playing between like my fingers and my pick, and hearing what type of natural sounding tones I could get out of the software and instrument that I had. And listening back, there's a lot of opportunities that I could have changed the guitar tones and whatnot, but I don't know, I learned that lesson now and I'm doing that for my new music, so I'm grateful that these are here. And this last guitar part is probably the most obvious example of one that I should have had like a more interesting type of tone with, but it sits over the reverse guitars in the bridge. you hear that and it has a lot of similarities to a lot of the guitar riffs that I wrote, but I like the way it floats and slides and those little intricacies of hammering on, pulling off. Do I slide to the next note? Some of my favorite riffs are expertly executed in acknowledging those types of decisions. And even though I wish I had a different tone on it, I do really like the actual performance. I learned a lot from making this song. And when it came time to name it, I called it Literal because when you're trying to be clever and witty, you play with that concept. Like, am I saying this literally, or are you taking it in a literal way? And so the intention of this track is to just impart that feeling of kind of levity and joking and wit in trying to make a conversation interesting for yourself and make communicating as fun for you as it is for them, and hoping that like birth from that fun can become like a more deeper connection. So this is Literal. I hope you enjoy it.